I'm going to start with a bit of a biography. Um, I am not new to Romania. I was a protege, student, and friend of an ambassador before Ambassador Zuckerman, who made his mark in Romania, both as an opponent of the Ceausescu's, but also as an opponent of the United States State Department, which sometimes went hand in hand during the Cold War. A fellow by the name of David Funderburk from North Carolina, who, if you have not read it, it's available in every library in Romania. He wrote a wonderful book called Pinstripes and Reds, where he talked about his struggles in trying to get the State Department to say, we need to pay attention to Romania. They have a future. They have a future as an American ally when this wall eventually falls down, which he could see was just a few years away. So it is an honor for me to speak for him with great affection, and the affection I also hold for Ambassador Zuckerman. I'm going to start. I'm not a college professor. I'm someone who was born in khaki diapers. I'm not a philosopher, but I am a partisan of that continuum Western civilization that began the moment when Abraham walked out of his tent in the Judean desert over 3,000 years ago. And I'm going to talk a little bit, not about the particulars. You've heard about that. I'm not going to talk about the technicalities. I'm going to talk about why it is we're even here. And this is a speech I've been giving in particular throughout Eastern Europe. The last time I gave it, I was told that Mr. Orban was watching. And I don't think he particularly cared for what I was saying, but that meant that I think I made an impact. So in 1942, and by the way, I was also taught that there were 3 B's in public speaking: to be bold, be brief, and be gone. So I will try to live up to that. But in 1942, the great Chief of Staff of the United States Army, General George C. Marshall, went out to Hollywood, and he approached the great film director, Frank Capra, who had made movies like would make movies like It's a Wonderful Life. He made all of these great romantic comedies in the 1930s. And he asked him, I want a series of films for the American people entitled Why We Fight. Why are we in this monstrous struggle against fascist tyranny? And I want every American to see it. One of the narrators of that series of films was a young captain of cavalry named Ronald Reagan. And in a country of 140 million people, 2/3 of the American people saw those films. And I think in the spirit of General Marshall and Frank Capra, I think it's important for us at a gathering even as small as this to discuss why. Why should we stand for an idea called the West that, as I said, began 3,000 years ago in the Judean desert? Because if we can't define what the West is, and we can't defend it rhetorically, we certainly are going to have a hard time defending it kinetically. In 1886, and by the way, this is more of a critique of the United States than it is certainly of Eastern Europe, countries that have known both the jackboot and the hammer and the sickle and know what the threat coming from Moscow is. But in 1886, a young Theodore Roosevelt said that societies that cultivate patriotism in the present by keeping alive the memory of what we owe to the patriotism of the past fill an indispensable role in our republic. No country will accomplish anything for the world at large unless it elevates itself. And Donald Trump channeled Teddy in a speech that he gave in Warsaw in 2017, when he said that the defense of the West ultimately rests not only on means, but also the will of its people to prevail. The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. Look, we are the heirs of Abraham, of Isaac, Elijah, Thucydides, Cicero, Constantine, Michelangelo, Shakespeare, all the way up to our blessed Thomas Jefferson. The late American historian David McCullough said that Our reverence for the giants of the past and their heritage reinforces what we believe in, what we stand for, and what we ought to be willing to stand up for. And indifference to them and our history isn't just ignorant, it is rude. So as I mentioned, we have a 3,000-year expression of memory, what the great Catholic theologian G.K. Chesterton described as the democracy of the dead that refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. The Frenchman Raymond Aron put it simply, the Westerner is the man who accepts nothing unreservedly in our civilization except the liberty it allows each of us to create, to criticize, and the chance that it offers all of us to improve it. The devouring machine of ignorance and spite that in recent years has been cutting off the people of the West, particularly as manifest by the leaders of Western Europe, has made our people ashamed of our own history and has made them ashamed of what they should stand for. Harvard professor James Hankins said it this way: we have seen spread through our schools and institutions a malicious form of humility that is indistinguishable from self-hatred. This is the humility that humiliates, that seeks to blind all of us to our magnificent traditions and rub our noses like misbehaving dogs in our worst offenses. In the United States today, visit the presidential homes of Washington, Monroe, and Madison, and you will not find the children of the Enlightenment who gave the world its ultimate expression of ordered liberty under law, who brought forth and brought down the world's greatest empire in battle when they had very few resources. All you will hear is about men who were nothing more than caricatures of the great sins of the West's past. To strike at a nation's symbols is to question the nation's reason for being. Our heroes have been torn apart and our history fetishized. Voices on the American right unabashedly denounce Winston Churchill now as equally responsible for World War II as Adolf Hitler. These same people argue that our friends in Ukraine must be subsumed into Holy Russia because they claim Russia is a civilization state, I guess because it produces poets and pianists. But they marvel that Putin, in the next week, will stand and mouth pieties about the family and Christian civilization standing next to the patriarch. And they know so little of Russian history that they don't understand that the patriarch is on the payroll of the secret police, just as his father was, his grandfather was, and his great-grandfather was on the payroll of the Okhrana. Meanwhile, Putin is actively persecuting Christians, Protestants, evangelicals, Greek Catholics in both Russia and occupied Ukraine. Nowhere is this intersectional madness more apparent than in the case of Israel. When the left in Europe and the United States sees Israel and Hamas, it sees critical race theory. As the Jewish people rose in response to the bloodiest days since 1945, the world's oldest hatred reared its head in places once thought unimaginable. These are truly attacks on all of us. Western identity is uniquely tied to the history of the Jewish people and to the nation of Israel. If Israel did not exist, ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations would go out of business. Anwar was an active agent of Hamas. 40% of the General Assembly resolutions of the last 10 years have been about one tiny country, Israel. Israel is the only permanent agenda item on the docket of the UN Human Rights Council, a council that says nothing when Bashar Assad gasses and murders 800,000 Muslims in Syria, when Pakistan forces 1 million Muslims into the clutches of the Taliban, and it remains silent in 7 languages, when the Chinese communists imprisoned millions of Muslims in a concentration camp system that would make Joseph Stalin proud. Only when Jews are involved in conflict does the UN become interested. That Turtle Bay is now reinforced by the voices in London, Berlin, and Paris is a further obscenity. Back in September, the new axis of evil paraded themselves at the entrance to Tiananmen Square at Tiananmen Gate, looking out over the area where the communists massacred thousands of their fellow citizens in 1989. The scenes are familiar to people from Romania, masses of goose-stepping soldiers marching aside empty missiles and fighter aircraft that, like the Chinese army, have never been tested in battle, unless, of course, like the People's Liberation Army, killing your own people counts as combat. Side by side with Xi were the theocratic fanatics from Iran, Korea's fat, dark age dictator, and Vladimir Putin representing his prison of peoples. The only individual missing from the tableau was the late Fidel Castro. But never mind, the members of the Havana Politburo were somewhere in the rear of the picture. But the message was clear. The West is no longer declining, the West is dead. The liberal world order, policed by the United States and before it by the British Empire, is over. The display was a fundamental assault on historical truth. Xi, if you didn't follow it, rebranded the war in the Pacific as the war of communist resistance against Japanese aggression, with the Communist Party of Mao Zedong as the sole author of Imperial Japan's defeat. Xi thus claims glory for the new order, glory that is a fabrication. As you know, during World War II, the Communist Party of China hid in the mountains and watched the nationalists exhaust themselves by the hundreds of thousands against the Imperial Japanese Army. But you wipe out nationalist China's role in the defeat of Japan, and you have erased Taiwan's reason for being. What is not a fabrication is Chinese hegemonic ambition, buttressed by traditional Russian savagery and aided by what our dear friend from Eastern Europe, Sebastian Gorka, calls Islamofascism. At least she understands that one who controls the past controls the present. My fellow Southerner, William Faulkner, was more eloquent. The past is never dead. In fact, it is never the past. Romanians know that as well as anyone on the planet. So Putin began by waging a hybrid war on the West for decades, mounting assassinations, cyber attacks, and weaponizing migration to destabilize his neighbors. But he crossed the threshold earlier in the year. For the first time since 1942, NATO forces engaged Russians in NATO territory. Polish, Dutch, and Italian warplanes were scrambled to intercept Russian drones that had entered Polish airspace. Russian drones and missiles also struck EU and NATO legations in Kiev. There is no precedent for what happened in the skies over Poland, and one thing is clear. Putin's appetite for escalating risk is mounting. But before I go any further about Mr. Putin, let me knock down one argument that you often hear from the apologists in our country like Mr. Carlson and Ms. Owens. As Russia's death toll reaches 10 times the number of Americans who fought and died in my father's war, 10-year war in Vietnam, and Putin unleashes traditional Russian barbarity on civilians because he is stalemated on the battlefield. He wants you to believe that NATO is responsible for the barbaric acts in Ukraine, that rounds of NATO enlargement made Russia insecure, forcing it to lash out. This argument has two key flaws. First, NATO is a defensive alliance and has sadly been shrinking exponentially in terms of its military capabilities since 1989. NATO has been a variant, but not a constant source of tension with Russia. The Kremlin's complaints about the alliance tend to spike only after democracy breaks out in the post-Soviet space, most recently with the election of Zelensky. This highlights a second flaw, and you know it in Romania. Putin fears democracy and the threat that it poses to his regime, and not NATO expansion. Taking the latter off of the table will not cure his appetite. The declared goal of the invasion of Ukraine, denazification is a code for the end game, anti-democratic regime change while restoring Russia's faded empire. And as you know better than anyone, Ukraine is the key. And Putin, like Xi, is rewriting history. Denazification is a continuation of a Russian lie that it won the Second World War and is still entitled to the spoils of victory. Peruse any Putin-approved history and you will not read that it was the industrial strength and wealth of the United States and the British Empire waging a global as opposed to a continental war that kept the Soviet Union afloat in the wake of Stalin's diplomatic and military blunders and his psychotic massacre of the Red Army's officer corps. Con Coughlin of the London Telegraph has said, right now, though, the richest European nations are sleepwalking toward disaster. Even little Denmark, which has faced the brunt of Islamic extremism, has punched above its weight, both rearming and sounding the alarm. Even Prime Minister Friedrichsen, a left-wing Democrat, understands that the Western Europeans' muddled thinking is compounded by a distinct lack of urgency regarding Europe's attempts to prepare for a future confrontation with Russia. In London and Paris, the main priority, despite the rhetoric, appears to be working out which domestic spending programs, such as fixing potholes, come from reducing the defense budget. Your friends in tiny Lithuania can put more soldiers in the field in 48 hours than the combined armed strength of Germany and the United Kingdom, the world's fourth and fifth largest economies. So what does that leave America? We talked a little bit earlier today about our basic strategic posture, and that really hasn't changed since Thomas Jefferson's time. The protection of the liberal world order is essential for the continued safety and prosperity of the American people. The freedom to navigate the global commons has expanded since Jefferson's 19th century sea lanes to include air, space, and cyber. For the United States, this means preventing one nation or a combination of nations from dominating any one of the commons. During the rivalry with the Soviet Union, the prospect of defending the commons was easy conceptually. However, the rise of China, revanchist Russia, and militant Islam convinced many, particularly on the right in our country, that the world is far too complicated for traditional strategic thinking, and we must once again retreat behind our oceans, or at best, withdraw from all parts of the world except for the Pacific and the Caribbean. So who cares who controls the wheat fields of Ukraine? That is a prescription for national suicide. America's military, economic, and cultural power is indispensable if we are to preserve the civilization that we share, civilization that was once defended to the death on the very ramparts that your ancestors sacrificed for, first against the Islamic invasions and then against the communist tyranny. Golda Meir warned us, when someone tells you over and over again he wants to kill you, believe him. And we'd better believe Xi, Putin, and the mullahs. So we have come to this, once again. Control of the Eurasian landmass is once again control of the world. It is on Europe as much as the United States to rediscover our historic virtues and fulfill them, or if not, betray those thousands of years of human progress. So who is in charge of the clattering train? The axles creak and the couplings strain, for the pace is hot and the points are near, and sleep has deadened the driver's ear. And signals flash through the night in vain. Death is in charge of the clattering train. So recited Winston Churchill on the floor of the House of Commons as the tide of appeasement overwhelmed the traditional good sense of the British people while Germany rearmed and Hitler swallowed Central Europe piece by piece. When the reckoning was finally tallied, 40 million were dead, and the great man lamented, "There never was a war more easy to stop than that which has just wrecked what was left of the world from the previous struggle. The malice of the wicked was reinforced by the weakness of the virtuous." So we have reached that point again. We still have time to stave off the confrontation. by confronting the malice of the wicked before someone utters the most lamentable words in the English language, too late. I thank you for your courtesy. I thank Ambassador Zuckerman for his leadership. I thank the people of Romania whom I started learning about at the feet of a great American ambassador, David Funderburg. I thank you for what you stand for. And I will end on a more positive note. America's been down this road before. The graveyards of the world are filled with the likes of the Kaiser and the Bolsheviks and the fascists and the imperial Japanese who thought America was weak. The American people are proud. We are proud of our friends, and we are proud of the unique place that we hold in the conscience of the world. And I thank Romania for being on the front line of freedom, and I wish you all a very happy and prosperous Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and God bless everyone.